Look at these faces. Look at them carefully. These are not refugees fleeing a foreign invasion. These are not the victims of a famine in some forgotten corner of the earth. These are the citizens of a nation that publicly boasts of hypersonic missiles, underground missile cities, and nuclear enrichment capability that has kept the world's most powerful intelligence agencies awake for 2 decades. The country you are looking at right now is Iran, a civilization stretching back more than 3,000 years, a state sitting atop the 4th largest proven oil reserves on the planet, and a regime that has spent 40 years telling its people and the world that it answers to no one. And yet, here they are, men and women clutching plastic containers, children pressing against one another in lines that stretch around entire city blocks, old men sitting on the curb, heads bowed, waiting, not for bread, not for medicine, for water, just water. A substance so fundamental to human existence that its absence represents not merely a humanitarian crisis, but the complete and total unraveling of a state's legitimacy. What you are witnessing is not a moment. It is the culmination of 4 decades of catastrophic mismanagement, ecological warfare waged by a regime against its own geography, and the perfect storm of a military conflict that arrived not as the cause of this disaster, but as the match thrown into a room already soaked in gasoline. Tehran, a metropolis of 15 million souls, is dying of thirst in the middle of the 21st century. And the question that should be keeping every geopolitical strategist, every regional power, and every citizen of this volatile corner of the world awake at night is not whether Iran can survive this. The question is, what comes after it cannot? Because right now, something extraordinary is happening beneath the surface of the gunfire and the diplomatic statements and the satellite footage of burning oil facilities. A regime that built its entire identity around resistance, resistance to America, resistance to Israel, resistance to the West, resistance to modernity itself, is being brought to its knees not by any of those enemies. It is being brought to its knees by a force older and more patient than any army ever assembled. Nature itself has turned against the Islamic Republic, and nature does not negotiate. To understand how we arrived here, we need to go back, not just a few months, not just to the beginning of this war. We need to go back 4 decades, to the very moment the Islamic Revolution took power in 1979 and began making choices. Choices about water, about agriculture, about infrastructure, about the relationship between ideology and ecology that would eventually produce the catastrophe we are watching unfold in real time. Because this crisis was not inevitable. It was engineered, slowly, methodically, and with breathtaking incompetence. The regime that controls Iran built the architecture of its own collapse, brick by brick, dam by dam, drained aquifer by drained aquifer, across 40 uninterrupted years. Here is the number that defines everything: 63.8 billion cubic meters. That is the volume of groundwater Iran extracts from its soil every single year, the volume that nature can actually replenish through rainfall, snowmelt, and the slow geological processes that refill aquifers is 45 billion cubic meters. Every year, Iran steals almost 20 billion cubic meters from its own future. Every year, it draws down reserves that took thousands of years to accumulate. Scientists, hydrologists, and international water policy experts have been raising alarms about this trajectory since the early 2000s. Iranian environmental engineers submitted internal reports warning of systemic collapse as far back as 2008. Every single warning was ignored. Every single report was buried. And the reason they were buried is the same reason Iran's water crisis will never be resolved from within. The entity responsible for building and operating most of Iran's dams, most of its water infrastructure, most of its irrigation networks, is the same entity responsible for protecting the regime from internal dissent, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC did not build Iran's water infrastructure to serve the Iranian people. It built it to serve itself. Understand this, because it is the structural truth that underlies everything else. The engineering division of the IRGC, known as Khatam al-Anbiya, constructed more than 600 dams across Iran over 40 years. 600 dams. By comparison, the United States, a country with more than 3 times Iran's land area and a vastly larger economy, constructed fewer dams in the same period. But quantity was never the point. The point was revenue. The point was control. Most of these dams were built in geographically inappropriate locations, on rivers that could not sustain them, without proper environmental impact assessments, without long-term hydrological modeling, and without any coherent national water management strategy. Many were constructed on top of geological formations that made them not just inefficient, but actively destructive. The Gotvan Dam, perhaps the most catastrophic single infrastructure project in Iran's modern history, was erected directly above the Gachsaran Salt Formation, a massive underground salt dome that engineers explicitly warned would contaminate any water stored in the reservoir. Those warnings were dismissed. The dam was built. When the reservoir filled, it dissolved the salt beneath it, And the water that flowed downstream, the water that was supposed to irrigate hundreds of thousands of acres of some of Iran's most fertile agricultural land along the Karun River, arrived carrying salinity levels exceeding that of seawater. The date palms died. The fields turned white with salt crystals. The land became desert. One dam, billions of dollars, millions of ruined lives. And not a single official was held accountable because the organization that built it also controlled the courts, the security apparatus, and the Supreme Leader's office. This is the institutional cancer at the heart of Iran's water catastrophe. While the IRGC constructed dams that served as cash transfer mechanisms, with contracts awarded to affiliated companies, inflated beyond any reasonable cost, and completed with minimal technical scrutiny, the traditional water systems that had sustained Iranian civilization for millennia were left to crumble. Iran's ancient Qanat network, a marvel of gravitational engineering developed over 3,000 years, consisting of underground channels that transported water from mountain aquifers to agricultural plains without requiring a single pump, not a single drop of fuel, completely sustainable and self-maintaining, was systematically abandoned, replaced by diesel-powered extraction pumps that pulled groundwater at rates 20 times higher than the aquifers could naturally sustain. By 2024, more than 70 major plains across Iran had begun to physically sink, a process geologists call subsidence, as the water beneath them was vacuumed out and the soil above collapsed into the void. Tehran itself is sinking at a rate of 25 centimeters per year. Roads crack, buildings tilt on their foundations, and the deeper you dig for water, the more saline and toxic the remaining groundwater becomes, until eventually you hit bottom, and across large portions of Iran that bottom has already been reached. NASA climatologist Kaveh Madani, who served briefly as Iran's deputy head of environment before the regime forced him out for speaking too honestly, has stated the mathematical reality with devastating clarity. Iran's water resources, even if managed with perfect efficiency, can sustain a population of approximately 50 million people. Iran's current population is approaching 90 million and growing. The regime is not just drawing down a savings account. It has already spent the account, borrowed against every future deposit, and is now consuming the walls of the bank itself. And when Madani issued these warnings from inside the country, the regime's response was not to implement reforms. It was to push him out, because reform would mean confronting the IRGC's economic empire, and that was a price no government in Tehran was willing to pay. Now place that 40-year ecological catastrophe into the geography of Tehran specifically, and the scale of what is happening becomes almost impossible to comprehend. Tehran is supplied by 5 primary dam reservoirs: Lar, Lachin, Talagan, Karaj, and Mamlu, each feeding different zones and neighborhoods of the sprawling capital. In November 2025, satellite imagery analyzed by the Center for Strategic and International Studies revealed that the average water storage across all 5 dams had collapsed to somewhere between 5 and 11% of total capacity. The Lar Dam, which feeds some of the most densely populated areas of the city, registered at barely 1%. In hydrological science, any level below 10% is classified as dead storage. Water so mixed with sediment and mineral deposits that treating it to drinkable standards becomes technically complex and economically catastrophic. President Masoud Pezeshkian himself, in what was an unprecedented moment of public honesty that sent shockwaves through the Iranian political establishment, admitted on national television that if rainfall did not arrive before the end of November, Tehran would have no choice but to implement mandatory rationing beginning in December. He then made a statement so staggering in its implications that it deserves to be understood fully. He said the government had begun internal discussions about relocating the nation's capital entirely, southward to the Makran coast. Think about what that sentence means. The president of Iran, in official public remarks, suggested that a metropolis of 15 million people may need to be abandoned because the water is gone. Not because of bombs, not because of an enemy army, because 40 years of mismanagement had made the ground beneath Iran's greatest city incapable of sustaining human life at that density. That single sentence is arguably the most consequential thing any Iranian official has said in the 21st century. And it was said before a single bomb fell on a single dam, because the war, when it came, did not create Iran's water crisis. It simply removed the last emergency exits. The pumping stations that were already struggling to function went dark when the power grid took strikes. The water treatment plants that were running at half capacity ceased operating entirely when fuel supplies were disrupted. The tanker trucks that had been serving as the emergency distribution system for neighborhoods already cut off from pipe water became unable to operate when military checkpoints and road damage made urban logistics impossible. In Tehran's southern neighborhoods, already receiving water for only a few hours each night before the conflict began, the taps stopped entirely. What had been a slow-motion humanitarian emergency became, overnight, a full-scale survival crisis for the most populated city in the Middle East. And Tehran is only where the story is most visible. Travel northeast, 300 kilometers to Mashhad. Iran's second largest city, home to 4 million permanent residents, and the destination of 20 million Shia pilgrims every year. And you find a water catastrophe that predates the conflict by years. Mashhad was served by 4 primary dams: Dusti, Karde, Ardek, and Torok. By November 2025, the combined storage level across all 4 had fallen below 3%. The chairman of the Iranian Parliamentary Water Commission publicly confirmed, in language remarkable for its candor, that Mashhad had reached a condition of near-total water standstill. The Dusti Dam, the most critical of the 4, drawing from the Hari-Rud River near the Afghan border, experienced a separate geopolitical dimension to its collapse. When the Taliban government in Afghanistan expanded its own dam and irrigation infrastructure upstream, the flow reaching Iran dropped by approximately 80%. Mashhad responded by drilling more than 400 emergency wells, but the groundwater those wells accessed had already been over-extracted for decades, and many wells ran dry within months of being sunk. 4 million people shifted to an hourly rationing system. Neighborhood water schedules were posted on lampposts and distributed door to door, telling residents which street would receive water at which hour of the day. Long lines formed at public distribution points before dawn, families arriving with every container they owned. Buckets, pots, bathtubs dragged on wheels, plastic barrels strapped to motorcycles. The images looked indistinguishable from wartime siege photography from the previous century. But the war had not yet started. This was peacetime Iran in late 2025. Move southwest to Isfahan, the city that once inspired the Persian proverb that it was half the world. And you encounter yet another layer of this compounding disaster. The Zayandeh-Rud River, the waterway that has sustained Isfahan civilization for more than 2,000 years, that flows beneath the ancient bridges that are among the most photographed architectural monuments in all of Iran, has stopped flowing. Not slowed. Stopped. The riverbed beneath the Sayo-Sepol Bridge, which has stood since 1602, is now dust and cracked mud. The inflow into the river system stands at roughly 6 cubic meters per second. The outflow being demanded by agricultural and urban users downstream exceeds 28 cubic meters per second. That is a ratio of 1 to 5. The mathematics of extinction. Isfahan faces a complete drinking water emergency within weeks, under normal conditions. Under war conditions, with the power grid fractured and pumping infrastructure unreliable, that timeline collapses further. And to complete Isfahan's particular nightmare, the nearby Gatvan Dam, the salt catastrophe described earlier, has poisoned 370,000 hectares of formerly productive farmland downstream, turning one of Iran's historic breadbaskets into a saline wasteland. Isfahan does not merely face a water shortage. It faces the irreversible destruction of the ecological foundation on which it was built. Now extend this picture across the entire country, and the aggregate becomes almost incomprehensible. 28 of Iran's 31 provinces have declared critical drought status. 19 major dam systems across the national network sit at levels approaching empty. 3 strategic reservoirs have formally reached dead storage classification. Somewhere between 25 and 30 million Iranians are experiencing direct daily water shortages, meaning they cannot reliably access safe drinking water from a tap in their home. The entire population of 88 million exists within what water scientists call a water-stressed system, where supply cannot reliably meet demand even under optimal conditions. Lake Urmia, once the largest saltwater lake in the Middle East, a body of water that stretched across northwestern Iran and served as a critical ecological anchor for the entire region, has shrunk by 90% over the past 3 decades. What remains is not a lake. It is a salt flat. And the salt that covers its former bed does not stay still. Wind carries it across the northwest, into the lungs of millions of people in Tabriz and Urmia, and dozens of smaller cities, driving rates of respiratory disease and certain cancers to levels that public health researchers describe with language typically reserved for chemical weapons exposure. The people of northwestern Iran are breathing their own environmental collapse. 31,000 villages across rural Iran have been abandoned, not because of the war, because the water ran out. Farmers who spent their entire lives working land their families had cultivated for generations walked away when the wells went dry and the rivers stopped, and the government offered nothing but slogans about resistance and self-sufficiency. They moved to cities, to Tehran, to Mashhad, to Isfahan, cities that were already running out of water themselves. Migration did not solve the problem. It transferred it, and then multiplied it. Every family that arrived in Tehran from a dried-out village in Sistan or Baluchistan or Khuzestan added demand to a system already incapable of meeting the demand that existed. The informal settlements that expanded around the capital's southern and eastern edges, already the most water-deprived areas of the city, grew denser, poorer, angrier, and more combustible with every passing season. Here is where the military dimension of this crisis becomes strategically devastating in a way that no missile strike or cyber attack could replicate. When a modern military force goes to war, water is not an optional resource. It is not a comfort or a convenience. It is a hard biological requirement that cannot be substituted, rationed beyond a precise threshold, or replaced by willpower or ideology. According to NATO operational standards developed from decades of field experience across desert and mountain environments, standards that apply directly to the Middle Eastern climate context, a soldier operating in the field with 30 to 40 kilograms of equipment, managing the physiological stress of combat, and exposed to regional summer temperatures that routinely exceed 40 degrees Celsius, requires between 15 and 20 liters of water per day. Not for luxury, for survival, for maintaining cognitive function, for preventing heat casualties, for basic hygiene that prevents the spread of disease through military units, for vehicle cooling systems, for treating wounds. 20 liters per soldier per day is the operational floor below which a military force begins to degrade, not in morale, but in biological function. Iran's combined armed forces, the 190,000 personnel of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, plus the 350,000 soldiers of the regular Artesh, with an additional 600,000 Basij reservists potentially mobilized, represent a force of over 1 million uniformed personnel. Even deploying a fraction of that force, say 500,000 soldiers across active fronts and supporting positions, generates a daily water requirement of 7.5 to 10 million liters every single day. In peacetime, this demand is manageable through urban water systems, base infrastructure, and well networks. In wartime, when power grids fail, when pumping stations stop, when dams are at 1% capacity and the rivers have stopped flowing, there is only one alternative: transportation. Tanker trucks, thousands of them. Convoys moving water from wherever it can still be drawn to wherever soldiers are positioned. And here is where the military logic becomes truly catastrophic for Iran. A water tanker is not a stealthy vehicle. It is large, slow, distinctively shaped, travels predictable routes along supply corridors, and requires fuel that is itself in short supply. From the perspective of coalition air power equipped with precision-guided munitions, drone surveillance, and real-time signals intelligence, a column of water tankers is not a difficult target. It is the most straightforward category of target that exists: slow, large, essential, and irreplaceable. Destroy a tanker convoy, and within 24 hours, the battalion it was supplying becomes combat ineffective. Not because their weapons are damaged, because their kidneys are beginning to fail, because their decision-making has degraded, because the human body, under conditions of severe dehydration, becomes a physiological system in emergency shutdown. Within 72 hours of complete water deprivation in high-temperature operating conditions, combat effectiveness collapses to zero. This is not a strategic assessment. It is biology, and biology cannot be overridden by revolutionary ideology or devotion to the supreme leader. The Iranian military's doctrine for decades has been built around the concept of protracted warfare, the ability to sustain an asymmetric conflict over months or years by leveraging deep terrain knowledge, dispersed logistics, and the enemy's unwillingness to absorb indefinite casualties. The doctrine assumes a functioning logistics network. It assumes that fuel, ammunition, food, and water can flow from interior supply bases to forward positions along a web of routes complex enough that destroying any single node does not collapse the whole system. That assumption was predicated on infrastructure that no longer exists at adequate levels. And when you overlay the water bankruptcy of Iran's geography on top of that already stressed logistics picture, the doctrine does not just become difficult to execute. It becomes physically impossible. You cannot fight a war of attrition when you cannot keep your soldiers hydrated. Nature has a veto over military strategy that no amount of operational planning can override. The coalition, and this is where the operational genius of the strike campaign becomes fully apparent, did not need to destroy Iran's missile stockpiles directly to neutralize Iran's military capacity. They needed to destroy Iran's ability to move things. And they accomplished this not with a single massive offensive, but with a methodically sequenced interdiction campaign that systematically severed every logistical artery connecting Iran's interior military infrastructure to its operational fronts. The railway strike on the night of April 7th was the most visible single operation in this campaign, but it must be understood as the culmination of 6 weeks of preparatory intelligence work and sequenced strikes rather than a standalone event. Iran's railway network, 11,000 kilometers of track connecting Tehran to every corner of the country, handling over 16,000 freight cars and millions of tons of cargo annually, was the vascular system of the IRGC's strategic missile logistics. For 20 years, the Revolutionary Guards had operated a dispersal doctrine built on 4 phases: scatter, conceal, transport, and launch. No fixed silos, no permanent launch positions. Missiles, solid fuel, guidance components, and technical teams moved constantly through the network, making comprehensive targeting by enemy intelligence almost impossible at any given moment, because the arsenal was not a location. It was a moving organism with no fixed address. The railway was the circulatory system that kept that organism alive. And like all circulatory systems, it had choke points, critical junctions without which the whole network lost function. Coalition intelligence identified 8 such choke points across the 11,000-kilometer network. 8 bridges, 8 nodes. And when those 8 points were struck simultaneously, the entire organism stopped moving. The Tabriz line, Iran's northwestern artery, operational since 1916, the oldest international railway connection in the country, had served as the primary supply corridor for IRGC storage facilities across the northwest, moving missile components, solid propellant materials, and specialized technical personnel in volumes that reached millions of tons annually. When its critical bridge was destroyed, an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 IRGC personnel in northwestern commands were severed from the central resupply network. Not weakened, severed. The Karaj line, Tehran's western gateway through the Alborz mountain pass, had connected major ammunition and missile component factories in Kermanshah to the capital's distribution hub. A single bridge destruction in the narrow mountain geography, where alternative road routes are geologically constrained, effectively isolated all western production capacity from the capital simultaneously. The Kashan-Yahyabad Bridge, perhaps the strategically heaviest blow of the entire operation, controlled the junction between Iran's north-south and east-west axes at the exact geographic center of the country. Just south of Kashan lies Isfahan, the heart of Iran's defense industrial complex, nuclear research infrastructure, ballistic missile engine manufacturing, IRGC technical logistics centers. Isfahan could continue producing, but with the Kashan Bridge gone, nothing it produced could move north into the distribution network. A weapons factory with no exit is, strategically, no different from no weapons factory at all. And then there was the dimension of this operation that no military analyst had fully anticipated, the psychological strike that preceded the kinetic one. Hours before the railway bridges were hit, a message appeared on Israel's Farsi-language social media channel. Simple, direct, a warning to civilians to stay away from railway lines. Internet access across Iran was severely degraded at that moment. Most of the population never saw the message, but the IRGC communications network did. And the result was that, for hours before the actual strikes occurred, the Iranian military suspended all railway shipments across the network. They did not know when the strikes were coming or which bridges would be targeted. They only knew that strikes were coming. And so, without a single bomb being dropped, a social media post paralyzed Iran's primary military logistics network for a critical operational window. The psychological dimension of modern warfare, the ability to freeze an opponent's logistics system through the threat of action rather than action itself, was demonstrated with a precision and economy that military historians will study for decades. The full picture of what Iran's military machine lost during Operation Epic Fury is, in the language of strategic assessment, staggering. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers carrying 13-ton bunker-penetrating munitions struck the underground missile complexes and command bunkers beneath Kandab, Fordo, and Isfahan, facilities Iran had spent 2 decades and billions of dollars building precisely because it believed no weapon could reach them at their depth. It was wrong. The GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, the largest non-nuclear bomb ever deployed by any military force in history, can reach targets buried under 40 meters of reinforced concrete. Iran's underground cities, impressive by regional standards, were not impressive by the standards of the weapons now being used against them. B-1B Lancers, launched from bases in the United Kingdom, struck underground storage complexes. B-52 Stratofortresses executed more than 2,000 precision strikes within a 100-hour window, a tempo of aerial bombardment that exceeded anything seen in the Middle East since the opening of Operation Desert Storm in 1991. In 3 days, Iran's air defense network, the radars, the surface-to-air missile batteries, the command and control infrastructure that gave the Revolutionary Guard Air Force any ability to contest the airspace above the country, was reduced to wreckage. Every major Artesh air base received strikes. The F-14 Tomcat fleet, the crown jewel of Iranian air power, a weapon system that America had not exported to any other nation and that Iran had maintained for decades as its symbol of aerial sovereignty, was eliminated entirely. Iran's own defense minister subsequently acknowledged on the record that air power had been effectively destroyed, and that the defense industrial base had sustained damage approaching 90%. It was, by any measure, the most comprehensive dismantling of a nation's military infrastructure in the history of aerial warfare conducted without the use of nuclear weapons. And yet, the most consequential operation of this entire campaign was not conducted with bombs at all. It was conducted with a telephone call, or more precisely, with the deliberate and very public knowledge that a telephone call might have taken place. When the White House indicated that Washington was conducting direct diplomatic engagement with Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagheri Ghalibaf, a former Revolutionary Guards Air Force commander who had also served as Tehran's mayor and run for the presidency 3 times. And when President Trump suggested in publicly reported remarks that Ghalibaf was among the most respected figures in the Iranian leadership structure and the person Washington wanted to deal with going forward, the effect inside the IRGC command structure was like detonating a shaped charge directly inside the institution's nervous system. Because in the architecture of the Islamic Republic, where trust within the system is maintained through mutual ideological commitment enforced by the ever-present threat of the intelligence apparatus, the mere suggestion that the regime's second most powerful figure may have opened a back channel to Washington is not just a rumor. It is a weapon. It does not need to be true to be lethal. It only needs to exist. The history of why this weapon is so effective requires a brief return to 2023, when a high-ranking IRGC intelligence officer named Ali Nasiri was arrested on suspicion of having provided targeting coordinates to Israeli and Western intelligence services. The Nasiri case blew open a wound inside the IRGC that had never fully closed. The realization that the precision of Israeli operations against Iranian targets inside Iran, from the assassination of nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh to the sabotage operations at the Natanz enrichment facility, had required intelligence penetration at a depth that only an insider could achieve. The IRGC responded to the Nasiri arrest with a massive internal security purge. Hundreds of personnel had their security clearances suspended. Dozens of senior officers were removed from command. Internal investigations multiplied across every provincial command. The institution turned inward, became paranoid, began watching itself more carefully than it watched external threats. Now, in 2026, with the Ghalibaf signal planted into the already paranoid consciousness of the IRGC command structure, that institutionalized paranoia was reactivated at a scale far exceeding 2023. The strikes against underground bunkers and secret radar facilities had already been too precise, too accurate. The belief that someone was transmitting coordinates from inside the command structure had already taken root in the minds of senior commanders before the Ghalibaf story broke. When it did break, it did not introduce a new fear. It confirmed the old one and gave it a face, a name, and a rank. The man who might be selling them out was not a mid-level intelligence officer this time. It was the Speaker of Parliament, the former commander of the air wing that the IRGC had entrusted with its most sensitive strategic assets. What followed was predictable in retrospect, but operationally devastating in practice. Patrol boat commanders in the Strait of Hormuz, the officers responsible for the asymmetric harassment operations that had been the cornerstone of Iran's deterrent strategy in the Gulf for 20 years, began hesitating before executing orders. If they reported their positions, were they sending those positions to someone who would relay them to the coalition? If they moved their vessels to intercept coalition shipping, were they moving into a kill zone created by a commander who had already telegraphed their route? The instinct to act was overridden by the terror of betrayal. Mine-laying operations that should have begun in the shallow waters around Karg Island did not proceed at the pace or scale that the defensive doctrine required. Reinforcement convoys to strategic positions did not move. The entire Iranian military, at the precise moment when coordinated action was most critical, froze. Not because it lacked weapons, not because it lacked personnel, but because it could no longer trust its own chain of command enough to operate through it. In military theory, this condition is called command paralysis. It is the most decisive form of strategic defeat because it does not destroy capability. It renders capability inert. A loaded weapon held by a hand too uncertain to pull the trigger is, for all practical purposes, no weapon at all. The power vacuum that produced this paralysis has its structural roots in the transition of supreme leadership. When Ali Khamenei died, the man who had served as the supreme arbiter of Iranian state power for 35 years, balancing the competing claims of the clerical establishment, the IRGC, the judiciary, and the Guardian Council, through a combination of personal religious authority, political cunning, and the unwritten rules of a system he had built around himself. The institution he left behind was one that had been designed for him specifically and no one else. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, elevated to the supreme leadership position on the night of March 8th to 9th. In what was by all accounts an extraordinarily hasty and contested process within the Assembly of Experts, inherited the title but not the authority. Mojtaba had spent his career in the shadows of his father's intelligence network. He had never held direct command of the IRGC. He had never presided over the judiciary. He had never built the network of personal obligations and institutionalized debts that his father had used to keep every center of power aligned. When Mojtaba was wounded in the airstrikes on Tehran, and when reports emerged that he had been evacuated to Moscow on a Russian military aircraft at Putin's personal request, the already fragile fiction of unified supreme leadership evaporated entirely. The supreme leader was in Moscow. The army was fighting a war it could not win. The parliament speaker was suspected of secret dealings with Washington. The foreign minister was signaling a desire for peace that the military refused to honor. There was no arbiter left. There was no single figure whose authority could reconcile these contradictions. And without that authority, the Islamic Republic was not a weakened state. It was a state in the process of disintegration. The diplomatic picture that emerged from this institutional collapse was, by any measure, one of the most chaotic scenes in the recent history of Middle Eastern statecraft. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi publicly welcomed any initiative that could bring the conflict to an end, stating that diplomatic relations with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and other neighboring countries remained intact. The language of a government that knows it is lost and is searching for a face-saving mechanism to acknowledge it without triggering domestic collapse. IRGC Commander Hussein Salami's office simultaneously issued statements asserting that operations were continuing at maximum intensity, that the defense of Hormuz and the underground tunnel network was active, and that a ceasefire was only a valid discussion topic once the enemy had unconditionally surrendered. Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf declared publicly that Iran was not seeking a ceasefire and would retaliate against the aggressor with full force. Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Garibabadi rejected any suggestion of negotiation. Senior official Mohsen Razi stated that the war would end only when the United States paid full compensation for all damages and withdrew every military vessel and personnel from the Persian Gulf. 4 different voices from 4 different nodes of the Iranian state apparatus saying 4 incompatible things simultaneously. This is not strategic ambiguity deployed as a negotiating tactic. This is institutional disintegration made audible.